Silicon Valley is a culture. It's this permission to experiment, it's permission to fail. Your whole career doesn't get ruined if you take intelligent risks and fail. You take dumb risks and fail, your career does get, not all failure is equal. There's intelligent failure, thoughtful failure, and then there's dumb failure. And you want one kind of failure, not the other. But the key is you can't have innovation without failure. It's the definition of innovation is something radical, something risky, make that happen. So I think that's very, very important part of culture. So when people say they're setting up innovation in Lockheed, and I don't want to pick Lockheed, they're the same as everybody else, it just is not possible to do. As much as, so if you said, let's go start from zero and go to Mars today, almost certainly some entrepreneur will get there on 1/10 the dollars compared to anybody who's well-resourced or understands the problem. The people who understand it will limit themselves to known choices to get there. And it's a very different way of thinking.
Do you want to see increased competition empowering the next generation of companies to really compete and do more work with government, not just in the US, but elsewhere?
I think almost always the issue is the time it takes. So, and I explained this earlier, innovation depends on your rate of learning, which is the more you fail in small ways and get on an exponential learning curve, the better you will be. So creating those environments is important. So let's say one of our companies wants to do a job with the government. Doing something that will take 5-7 years, you don't have your first failure for a long time. But you had lots of small little things that you could go back and fix rapidly and learn rapidly, get response back. To encourage innovation, tolerate small failures and lots of them, but in a way where you're traveling a learning curve and getting better. I'll give you an example of an odd investment we just made. Mark 5 drones. Right?
Oh, Hermes.
Hermes. So they're really doing, it's our fairly recent investment, made it a few months ago. They want to build Mark 5 passenger jets. And they just decide they'll do Mark 5 drones. Good thing they don't have to deal with the FAA if they're doing it for the military. Said, great, we'll do that. And it's pretty critical to get in and out of Syria without being shot down. If you get shot down, you're over territory, you don't care as much as if you had a crash over San Francisco. So it's a great environment to experiment in. You can do it privately, you can test structures, you can do a lot of things. And since they want to do autonomy, they've taken the biggest risk out, which is killing anybody if they crash. It's a great iterative learning environment, and they will get, or hopefully they'll get to their Mark 5 passenger jet, but they're doing it in incremental steps that let them test a lot of things. So the best way, let me define it a little differently. Nobody, all of us want to climb Mount Everest. Nobody got to Mount Everest without getting to base camp first. And then camp 1 and camp 2 and camp 3. None of those camps are in a straight line to Everest. You don't, the best way to conquer an enemy isn't go head on. It's be clever about the stepping stones along the way, learning along the way, adjustments along the way, and then find your way to the top. It's sort of what all large innovative programs should do, because you can't plan them. Discovering the problems is part of planning. So I always say, in large ambitious objectives, you don't plan. You plan to plan and know what you have to watch out for, and then add more things to watch out for on the journey. And that's what's fundamentally different. It's what startups are forced to do.
And I'm sure I speak on behalf of the Air Force, and part of that incremental acquisition process is to prove they can solve the problems the Air Force needs to fix. And any minute now, we'll be learning about the awardees and who's been awarded that pot of money to continue to grow and implement those capabilities into the warfighter. So
let me give one last example that just comes to mind about, in 2010, I was asked to give a talk at a Navy conference. 150 of Navy's admirals were here. And they were talking about energy, its impact on the Navy, sustainability, climate change. This was 2010. And the theme was making a plan to 2040, so a 30-year plan. And I asked the following question. I said, what was important for the Navy in 2010? Number one threat happens to be China, or for planning purposes. I said, in 2000, what was was China among the top 3 threats? And it wasn't. So if you go back to old reports, China was not considered a threat in the 1990s. So I said, you're doing a 30-year plan. In the last 10 years, your objectives have so dramatically changed. So you're just fooling yourself into thinking you know what you're planning for 30 years. What you really should be doing is planning for dynamic behavior, dynamic changes, how things might change. And I think it'll happen again. You know, we don't know how the current geopolitical situation will play out. I couldn't tell you where things will be. Let me add a compounding factor. I know we are out of time. I add AI to the international war, and I mean both physical wars, cyber wars, and economic wars. No one variable will cause more change than AI. So imagine if one side in the war had a gasoline engine and the other side didn't. We did see one side with nuclear bombs and the other side not in the past. AI is a bigger factor than either nuclear bombs or gasoline engines, and it may be the most important factor. Now, how that plays out will dramatically affect our strategy, both economic and military.
You have a consensus here, I'm certain. Everyone
right?
agrees with you.
So the world keeps changing, and we have to plan to adapt rapidly. And the more the rate of change increases, the more the rules we use to plan the future have to be dramatically different.
Amen to that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vinod. Round of applause, everybody. Thank you. Did you want to stick around?